That night, Chase dreamed of a quiet town. He found himself walking through empty streets, blanketed in dense fog that obscured much of his vision. He tried to call out, but not a single soul answered him. Old cars laid abandoned in the streets, and empty stores and offices lined every building. Scraps of paper and leaves roamed free in the air, the distant sound of church bells ringing out an unknown distance away. Chase idly wandered the streets, turning his head around in an attempt to find someone, anyone to make sense of the forgotten world he'd been taken to. Hearing nothing but his own paw steps and gently humming wind in his fur, he began to wonder if he was truly alone. However, he soon arrived at a new structure that had emerged through the fog. The lookout. His ears stiffened in surprise as he looked up at the tower in confusion. The main entrance had several wooden boards nailed into it, barring anyone from accessing the elevator. Feeling a cold mist rise within him, Chase shakily approached his home until he stood before the blocked entrance. Hesitantly peering through the boards, he caught a glimpse of a dog standing in the open elevator. It was a German Shepherd, judging by the tail and ears, and was hunched over as if it was choking. Chase made an attempt to call out to it, and the dog slowly stopped moving and peered back at Chase. The dog had a look of hopelessness, resignation, like it knew it had nothing left to live for. The dog began bleeding from the mouth, and Chase stepped back as the fog closed in around him. Chase opened his eyes, awakening from the dream. He sat up sharply, the cold feeling still lingering inside him. A few tears instantly left his eyes, the shrouded loneliness of the dream leaving a scar on his mind. He shook his head, trying to push away the empty ambiance that filled his head as he slowly broke into a quiet sob. The returning drive back to the lookout felt unreal, almost static, as Chase struggled to process the presence of a parasitic monster in Adventure Bay without trying to crash his rig. Watching the road was almost hypnotizing, lulling Chase into a bland state of numbness that seemed to block the sounds of everything around him. At that moment, all he could hear was distant white noise in his head. Scratching groans that could only be identified as a broken guitar repeatedly churned in his ears, and an oddly soothing feeling washed over him. Upon returning home, he didn't acknowledge his friends or see if they were around. He just went right to bed. Now awakened from his dream, Chase heard the falling rain tap against the roof of his kennel, quiet thunder echoing in the distance. Checking his wall clock, the shepherd realized it was only 4 a.m. Lowering himself back onto his bed, he tried to shut his eyes and fast forward through the night by falling back into slumber, although his body refused to rest. Was it true what Cyrus had said? Chase pondered over what Cyrus had told him, his tail curling underneath him in silent distress. A monster in Adventure Bay, a creature who killed others without remorse. Never in his life had he encountered such a thing. He had watched the news plenty of times, leaning back in horror and disgust as he read about the atrocities going on in the world around him. But never once had something of the sort entered his own city. A monster who dragged innocent victims to merge with itself. A cold, emotionless figure who held no concept of mercy. And the worst of all, a detail that left a dark stain on Chase's mind. The creature could hide dormant in the bodies of others. Surely that had been a lie, a cruel, twisted joke from the captain to scare the small puppy. The police dog's eyes watered again as a mellow wave of sound entered his head, complete with the flickering melody that resembled a grieving piano. He tried to force it out, but a foul image stabbed into his head. He saw his beloved friends, Marshall, Rocky, Zuma, Rubble, Sky, and Everest, their bodies leached and ensnared into one another. The monster's bloody tendrils sewed them together as it slowly overpowered their minds, merging them into one horrible being. He violently shook his head, getting up to pace around his kennel as his body began quivering. Someone in Adventure Bay was being used as a shell, containing the monster as it silently hid within their body. Chase stopped, staring ahead at his wall as a somber song wept in his mind. If this person, this host, was not found and destroyed as soon as possible, everything he knew and loved would be at risk. "I won't let this happen," Chase breathed out, then turned to exit his kennel. He walked out through the entrance and entered the rain, instantly soaking his brown fur. The night had shrouded the land around him, but he knew exactly where he was going. Walking through the rain, he traversed across the wet grass into the trees. He had no fear of the darkness around him, nor of the pounding rain like Rocky. For a moment, he barely noticed how wet he was getting, his mind overtaking his senses and seemingly blocking them out. Eventually, he came to a large hatch in the ground with a rusted turning wheel sticking out. It was slightly flooding over from the rain, but he knew when it was built all those years ago that it was well watertight. All he had to do was turn the wheel a few times, and the steel hatch would slowly unlock, its secrets ready to be exposed. Chase sighed and placed his paws on it. "Chase?" called a voice behind him. The police dog spun around in surprise, a shocked expression plastered on his face. He relaxed when he recognized a familiar chocolate lab. "What are you doing out here?" Zuma raised an eyebrow, tilting his head. "Why are you out here?" Chase countered, turning to face the lab. "Because I like walking in the rain. You know that," he replied, then looked out past Chase. "What's that on the ground?" The shepherd looked away, gentle shame resting over him. He wanted to lie and say it was nothing, but Zuma wasn't an idiot. He realized there was no hope in trying to play it off, so Chase resigned and opened up to his friend. "Promise not to tell anyone?" Sure. But what is it?" "It's a bunker," Chase explained. "Ryder had it built back when the Paw Patrol was just beginning." "Oh, cool!" Zuma bounced, wagging his tail slightly. "What's in it?" "You sure you want to know?" "Well, yeah." The lab walked closer. "I'm curious now." Chase sighed and returned to facing the hatch. "Just remember, you promised not to tell anyone." He placed his paws on the wheel and rotated it a few times to the left. Inner mechanisms could be heard underneath at work, slowly unlocking the dark vault of painful tools Chase fought for years to never touch. "Can you actually give me a paw with this?" he asked apologetically, coming to the handle that stretched across the front side in his teeth. Zuma nodded and walked to the opposite side, clamping his teeth into the other end of the handle. With the small count to 3, they grunted and pulled with all their might, slowly opening the large hatch. It made an unsettling noise as it opened, like a creaking elderly man trying to open his jaw. Warm air began escaping from the bunker. The moonlight illuminated a narrow staircase as rain already began invading through the opening. Zuma peered down into the dark corridor. "Wow," he breathed in awe. Chase took a deep breath and began descending the staircase, motioning for the lab to follow him. The dogs were bathed over with warm air as they traveled down, both jumping slightly as the hatch loudly closed behind them. After a few moments, they reached the solid concrete ground, and Chase flicked a light switch with his nose. Light suddenly shone brightly from the overhead lights, banishing the darkness from the corners of the bunker. Zuma could be heard gasping as the narrow corridor's contents were finally revealed. The bunker was simply a large hallway that stretched out an impressive length. The walls were lined with crates and wall hangers, all displaying various displays of weapons and tactical gear. Zuma's glee of discovering something new was quickly replaced with surprise, then bled into horror.
"What is all this?"
he asked fearfully, resting his eyes on a large riot shield that leaned against the wall, shining in the light.
"The police division refers to this as riot gear," Chase explained. "I've had this stuff for years, just never needed to use any."
The lab seemed frozen to the floor, fearing that taking even a step would accidentally set off something explosive. Chase, however, was already walking around, looking at each item up and down. He passed by shelves of idle tear gas grenades, forever waiting for their rings to be pulled, leading to the spewing of irritant gas that could make anyone clear away. Zuma fearfully crept past a wall of tasers and batons, bulletproof vests hanging on hooks.
"Chase,"
he began.
"Why are we here?"
The shepherd sighed and looked back at his friend.
"I just needed to get something."
He approached a small case sitting against the wall. It shone in polished silver, resting in place as if it was hibernating. Carefully avoiding eye contact with Zuma, he gently undid the clasps and opened the case. His eyes laid to rest on a sight he previously swore he'd never see again: a small handgun. The standard issue for police officers, a semi-automatic pistol meant to be holstered on one's person. A tool for control and violence officers of the law were trained to be unafraid of drawing. The shepherd tried to prepare himself for a shudder that would course through his body, but it never came. He expected himself to be unsettled at the sight of the gun, but he was oddly unfeeling at its presence, like finding an item you had lost some time ago. Ferox Malice, the parasite that could be stalking the bodies of Adventure Bay as they spoke, had to be stopped. Chase would never sleep again if the city fell to ruins, and he could have done something about it. If it was true that Ferox Malice was hiding inside someone, then he would have to do what had to be done. He had to find the host, whoever it may be, and kill them. It was his duty as a police dog to protect the people he cared about, and he would be damned if he didn't pull out every stop to hunt down the threat. Before Zuma could see the weapon, he quickly shut the case, making a mental note to return later with his pup pack. The pack had a secret compartment meant to hold and holster the gun. It was never a modification. His pup pack always had it since day one, yet Chase resented using it, and the gun he was given forever hibernated in the artillery bunker hidden in the forest. Until now. Zuma could be heard shuffling back the hatch, eager to escape the corridor that contained the tools of violence and order.
"We missed you at the Putt-Putt Boogie contest,"
he said nervously, trying to steer into a more light-hearted conversation. Chase turned back to him, pushing the gun case back into place. "Sorry, I had an errand to run."
"It's fine."
Zuma slightly lowered his head.
"We had to stop early because Sky was coughing."
It was those words that made Chase's ears shoot up in alarm, and he prayed Zuma didn't notice. A freezing wave of dread rushed him over, stabbing into his head as his heart quickened. The shepherd seemed to draw back, attempting to hide his recoiled expression, but faint twitches of his face betrayed him. A horrible truth rose from the depths of all that was horrible and seized Chase, and his heart sunk. Cyrus never mentioned if the monster had a preference for the bodies it hid in, meaning his own Paw Patrol was at even more risk than he had imagined. He slowly looked toward Zuma with a fearful expression, and the lab stepped back in unease. Hastily, Chase studied the other dog up and down, flicking his eyes to each corner of the lab, searching for the smallest hint of something amiss.
"Chase?"
wearily asked the lab, slightly retracting in discomfort.
Why are you looking at me like that?
Narrowing his eyes, the shepherd slowly moved to the side, flexing his paws with faint movements.
Why are you outside in the pouring rain at 4 in the morning?
He pressed the question as he began approaching Zuma, sniffing around him.
I told you, I wanted to walk in the rain.
The smaller lab stepped back, unease growing within him, and his flight response was mere moments away from sending him into a run. Chase raised an eyebrow, then sighed as he relaxed.
Sorry, I'm just on edge. Why though?
Flicking his eyes back to the gun case, the shepherd shook his head, pushing away the gentle chimes that rung in his head.
Just bad dreams.
As the night went on, they left the bunker and shut the hatch behind them. Chase made the lab swear up and down he wouldn't disclose its location to anyone, warning him that it was quote-unquote federal property. As they returned to their respective dens, Zuma shrugged off the tense night and went to bed. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when the clock struck 6 in the morning, an orange hue bleeding into the sky. No one noticed Chase slip away back into the forest, this time wearing his pup pack. He returned to the bunker and retrieved his handgun, holstering it into the hidden compartment of his pack. Chase's mind was screaming, his unease flooding him over as he felt himself disconnecting from the world around him. Who could he trust? Could anyone be trusted if they were all possible hosts for the parasite? Grimacing as he left the bunker again, now secretly armed, he returned to the lookout and gave a sweeping look at all his friends' kennels. Their homes made a circle around the lookout, a ring of dens each pup would find solace in. Chase grimaced and returned to his own kennel as the sun began rising further on the horizon. Yet the world around him seemed to appear in dense gray. The static in his head was noticeably becoming louder. It's well documented that dogs can feel nearly every emotion a human could experience. They're cognitively designed in such ways that they can feel happiness, sadness, anger, and especially fear. It's intriguing how fine-tuned their minds are to that of a person, as opposed to a mindless fish swimming in a cycle of unblinking static. Now, what of more complex emotions? Such things as love, shame, jealousy, guilt, or bashfulness. What happens when a dog is thrust into a situation they have no understanding of? The animal is suddenly bludgeoned with confusion, fear, paranoia, and no way to understand even a fraction of it. To learn that friends among you may not be what they seem can bring droplets of fear into one's head. Chase was afraid, terrified even, and hesitated even stepping outside. He occasionally glanced outside at the other dogs when they come out to play in the sun, trying to read their movements for anything unnatural. He especially narrowed his eyes every time Skye came into his field of vision. She seemed a little better, but a lack of symptoms didn't always mean the sickness was gone. In some cases, the pain suddenly vanishing could indicate the worst was about to ensue. Every now and then, Marshall would knock on his door, to which Chase rarely responded. The shepherd slipped out the next day, walking into town while avoiding eye contact with anyone. Despite not being in uniform, he still wore his pup pack, the visible straps connecting around his body. No one knew of the weapon that lay concealed within the backpack. All it needed was the audio cue of Chase's bark, and it would emerge. He had received a note under his door, ordering him to travel to the park for an important briefing. Usually, Chase would discard such a note and write it off as spam mail, but this note was explicitly signed by the ACG. As the wind brushed past his sides, Chase left the sidewalk as he crossed over into the grass. His mind still disobeyed his constant grips to clear his head, the static noise filling his ears and taking a life of its own. "I'm not crazy," the police dog breathed, shaking his head. He had lost significant hours of sleep, anxiety gripping him awake and leaving him afraid to shut his eyes for even a few minutes. He found a bright patch of grass and laid down on it, purposely straying away from the other dogs as much as he could. His attempts were futile, however, as out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a small terrier walking over to him. Chase stiffened, snapping his head in the other dog's direction. The terrier carried a smile on his face, a feeling of joy and carelessness. Chase knew this couldn't be the meetup. This dog was just an oblivious idiot, blind to the looming threat only he seemed to be aware of. "Hi," the terrier smiled. "I like your pup pack." Chase instantly growled in response, flattening his ears. Nothing could be trusted. Not a single one of the animals he shared the city with could be trusted. The terrier drew back in surprise, hints of confusion crossing his face. He wasn't at all expecting the hostility from the shepherd, knowing full well the reputation the Paw Patrol carried. The terrier held up his paws defensively. "I'm sorry, Piss off!" The smaller dog whimpered slightly and hastily turned, speeding off. Chase didn't leave the house thinking he would pull a gun on a random dog in the park, but the parasite could be anywhere. "You always talk to puppies like that?" came a voice to his left, and Chase whipped his head around. He relaxed slightly when he recognized the Belgian Malinois before him. "You told me that thing could be hiding anywhere," Chase waved off. "I swear, it's driving me crazy." "Awareness and vigilance are key, sure," Cyrus nodded as he approached. "But you can't snarl at every dog who comes before you." Chase raised an eyebrow, then sat up. "How do I know you're not infected?" "ACG members get screened twice a day," the Malinois explained, "including me." "Wait, you have a way to test yourselves for the virus?" Chase inquired. Cyrus nodded. "You give a blood sample on a swab," he explained. "You put it in a machine, and it scans you for Phoroxmalus. If you're infected, it'll come back positive." The shepherd's eyes widened. "Wait, why can't I have one of those?" "That's why I'm here." Cyrus reached into a pocket on his belt, pulling out a small device about the size of a box of cigarettes. It was a dull gray in color, with a small screen and hole at the bottom. "It used to be for drug testing, but our engineers have modified it," the Malinois nodded, pushing it over to Chase. "They're valuable and limited, so we don't usually give them out like this." Chase looked up with a confused expression. "Then why is it being given to me?" "You're a special case, being the Paw Patrol and all," he explained it the best he could. "Also, have you seen the weather?" The puppy shook his head. "There's a storm coming," Cyrus warned. "And not a small one either. It's highly likely most communication lines will go dark. You may lose power as well." "Oh, how fantastic." Chase hung his head in exhaustion. "When that storm hits, the ACG will have to temporarily assist in emergency services, and our investigation will have to pause. The reason I gave you that device is that we're going to be up to our ankles in helping out the public, so I'm entrusting you to start my own investigation," Chase finished. "But if..." He stopped for a moment, wincing as dark thoughts returned to his head. "If one of my friends ends up being it, how will I call you if none of our comms have gone dark?" "That pup tag I gave you," realizing. "I just don't like thinking about it." Cyrus sighed, briefly taking a moment to lick his paw. He knew Chase was just a puppy, and although he couldn't show it, he felt great sympathy for what the small dog may be about to go through. "Look, I'm afraid too," he said softly. I just want all this mess to be taken care of. All these people safe, you know? After a few seconds of staring at the ground, Chase nodded slowly, saddened as he lowered himself back to the ground. It's my job to protect people. I understand, Cyrus nodded. But protecting people can be dangerous. Dogs in the army, well, they die all the time protecting their homes. That's just war. We've seen that since the dawn of time. Bitter words began to seep from Chase's teeth. This is different. Anyone around me could be a monster, and I have no way of telling. They're not monsters, Chase. Cyrus looked over at the puppy. Yes, they're a host, but they aren't monsters. Yet, the shepherd hissed. Well, that's why I gave you the blood reader. Test your friends, and certainly test yourself, he instructed. If a reading comes back positive, call us right away. Chase looked up at him, briefly glancing at a group of dogs that ran past. There was a lingering question that had been on his mind, and he feared the answer. Cyrus? Chase asked. What exactly will happen to someone when you find the parasite in them? The Malinois sighed, tilting his head back slightly as he contemplated the answer. He didn't want to unroll the truth onto the puppy, but at the same time, he couldn't lie here, not to Chase. We trapped them, essentially, he explained. Try to seal them somewhere before Foroxmalis realizes they've been compromised. If we can't do it, and it erupts out of the host, I can only hope we can push it somewhere contained. Would the host survive this? Chase asked, voice growing weary. The larger dog looked away slightly, well aware that his answer wasn't going to be a happy one. Chase, we use the word erupt for a reason. I've seen the photos, the recordings. Foroxmalis tears itself out of the host's body, emerging out as a massive, gory creature. So, no, the host doesn't survive. Chase nodded in understanding. Get home, okay? The Malinois offered. I need to lead the ACG in our emergency relief for the storm. Your job right now is to protect your family. My family, Chase repeated, almost not understanding the meaning of the word. He hated saying it out loud, but there was no denying that he truly loved his friends. Marshall, who always made him laugh, Rocky's inspiring persistence to push forward, Zuma being the shoulder to cry on, Rubble as the one dog who everyone just adored, and Sky, the cockapoo Chase had shared countless missions with. He had to protect his family. He had to protect the ones he loved. Taking the device back home, Chase made haste in returning to his kennel. The storm clouds were already lurking in the sky above. It would only be a few hours before the rain began. As he entered his den and shut the door, a faint crack of thunder echoed above the city, a wordless warning of the terror to soon come. Sitting on his bed, Chase studied the blood reader before him, not much bigger than his own paw. He knew his friends would instantly question why the hell he was asking for blood samples. Such suspicions would put him in a compromising position. He'd have to be smart about this, and Chase lowered himself down to rest his chin on a pillow. The stress was getting to him, but at least now he had an opening, a flicker of foundation to make sense of the swirling chaos. All he had to do was find a way to retrieve blood samples from the others. It seemed crazy, but there had to be a way. There was a science to deception, and Chase wasn't qualified in the art. Even then, he worried about how the others would even perceive the idea of an unseen threat right under their noses. They had never seen such a thing in all their lives, and it was an open question of how much longer they'd go before they saw something truly disturbing. As of now, there were things to do. Chase sighed and got up from his bed, walking over to his desk where he kept most of his gear. Opening a small drawer, he rummaged around a few miscellaneous objects until he saw a bundle of Q-tips meant for cleaning ears. Collecting them swiftly, Chase searched a little more until he found the shining piece of metal at the bottom. It was a thin razor blade, the kind used to make X-Acto knives. Such a tool was capable of making even the most precise of cuts, not particularly designed for the devastating carnage, but sharp enough to gracefully slice through flesh and muscle. "I should get this over with," he thought aloud, and gently carried the blade in his teeth back to his bed. He activated the small machine with the switch on the side, and the screen blazed to humming life. It merely glowed, showing a distinct lack of any on-screen prompts. It would be easy to forget it was even on due to the lack of interaction the device offered. After a few seconds that Chase could only assume was the device configuration itself, it gave a small beep as 2 words flashed on the screen. "Awaiting sample." Taking a deep breath, Chase sat back and held out his left paw, dropping the blade into his right. Taking a sharp breath, he pressed the blade into the rough skin under the paw. He winced, sucking air through his teeth as he slid the blade across. All he needed was a single drop of blood. But his metacarpal pad refused to open, forcing him to hold back sounds of pain as he drove the blade in deeper. Just right, but now he had what he needed. Struggling to see through his own tears, he gripped a Q-tip and glided it across the bleeding underside of his foot. The small tool instantly collected the small stream, its cotton tip turning a blood red. Unable to suppress the pain any longer, Chase dropped everything and ferociously licked away at the cut until the stinging quieted. When he was sure his paw was soothed, he turned his attention back to the blood test. He hesitated before inserting it into the machine, knowing full well that his life was just a flip of the coin now. There were 2 outcomes, and his body faintly quivered knowing that one result would be the death of him. If it ended up being him, if he was the host for Ferox Malice, he would turn himself into the ACG without question. No one would ever see him again, and he would likely die once Ferox Malice emerged. But he was willing to give himself to keep Adventure Bay safe. Finally shoving in the Q-tip, the machine gave a whirring noise. The following few seconds felt like agonizing hours, like someone being forced to sit in the waiting room of a hospital while their lover was being wheeled into critical care. Finally, a single word flashed on the screen, a word Chase didn't believe for a split second. Negative. He was hit with a wave of relief so brutal he almost threw up. Despite the roaring storm he was under, the screaming noise and static in his head, and the constant anxiety, there was finally something that pulled a smile over his face. He wasn't infected, at least not yet. He still had a chance to prevent total devastation. A crack of thunder sounded in the distance, and gentle rain could be heard tapping away at his ceiling. The storm was coming in fast, soon to drape the city in darkness. He was playing a massive game of chess against an opponent he couldn't even see, and now it was time for his next move. Narrowing his eyes, a rush of determination flickered within Chase. All he needed now was for the others to partake in the blood test. He would not rest easy until all 5 of them were cleared.